Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're opening a file that, honestly, it looks like a really dry piece of economic history on the surface.
Right.
But once you actually get into the sources, you start to realize we're looking at the origin story of the modern world.
We really are. It's the moment the entire operating system of the global economy was, uninstalled and replaced with something totally experimental.
Yeah.
And the craziest part is that most people living through it, they had no idea. They didn't realize the magnitude of what had just happened.
We are talking about August 15th, 1971, a Sunday evening.
Which is a very specific time to make that kind of history.
Exactly. I mean, picture the scene. It's summer. People are just winding down for the weekend. The biggest show on TV, Bonanza, is on. And suddenly, the broadcast is interrupted. Not for a breaking news alert, but for the president, Richard Nixon, speaking from the Oval Office.
And he's on for maybe 15 minutes. He lists all these economic initiatives, wage freezes, price controls, that kind of thing.
But buried right in the middle of it all is this one sentence that it breaks the spine of the global financial order.
He says the United States is temporarily suspending the convertibility of the dollar into gold.
That word temporarily.
It's the most important word in the entire speech. And, as we now know, probably the most misleading.
Spoiler alert, it's been over 50 years, and that temporary suspension is still very much in effect. But to get why this was such an earthquake, we have to understand the ground we were all standing on before 1971.
Yeah, the sources really paint a picture of a world that was just obsessed with stability.
So where do we start?
You have to go all the way back to 1944. Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. World War II is still raging, but the Allies know they're close to winning, and they're already planning for the peace.
And you have delegates from 44 countries at this big hotel.
And the mood in that room is, well, it's trauma.
Right. These are people who lived through the Great Depression. They saw the hyperinflation in Weimar Germany.
Yeah.
Needing a wheelbarrow of cash just to buy a loaf of bread.
They saw how countries trying to devalue their currencies to get ahead, those beggar-thy-neighbor policies, help fuel the rise of fascism. They truly believed that economic chaos leads directly to war.
So they wanted to build a system that was bulletproof.
Exactly. Bulletproof. They wanted fixed exchange rates, no wild swings, no speculation, just pure stability.
And that's the Bretton Woods system. The architecture of it was actually pretty simple, wasn't it?
Simple, but very rigid. All the major world currencies, the French franc, the British pound, the German mark, they were all pegged to the US dollar at a fixed rate.
And the dollar was the linchpin. It was pegged to gold.
Specifically, $35 an ounce.
And this is the part that's so hard to imagine today. If you were, say, the government of France in 1960 and you had a pile of US dollars, those weren't just paper.
No, they were claim checks. They were literally as good as gold. The US Treasury was legally obligated to take your dollars and give you physical gold bars in return at that $35 rate.
And because the U.S. had most of the world's gold after the war and was the only real manufacturing economy left standing, the whole thing worked.
It worked incredibly well. It created this amazing era of stability for global trade.
But, like with any rigid system, pressure starts to build up under the surface. And the research really points to the 1960s as the decade where the math started to get fuzzy.
It's the classic guns and butter dilemma. In the 60s, the U.S. government was just spending massive amounts of money. You had the Butter-Johnson's Great Society, the war on poverty, Medicare.
And then you had the guns.
The escalating war in Vietnam.
And wars are expensive.
Incredibly expensive.
Right.
So how do you pay for all this? You print more dollars? The U.S. is just pumping dollars into the global economy.
At the same time, Europe and Japan are back on their feet.
Exactly. They're not rubble anymore. They're manufacturing powerhouses. They're selling cars and radios and TVs to Americans.
Which means Americans are sending dollars overseas to buy all that stuff.
Precisely. So now you have this situation where billions and billions of US dollars are piling up in foreign central banks in Paris, London, Tokyo.
And eventually, those governments look at their vaults full of paper dollars.
And then they look at the US gold reserves at Fort Knox, and they do some quick division.
And they realize there are way more paper tickets than there are gold prizes.
The ratio is completely off. The US had basically written more checks than it had in its account. And the first person to really, call this bluff was French President Charles de Gaulle.
I love this part of the story. It's like a high-stakes poker game. De Gaulle just says, I see your bet and I'm cashing out.
He called it America's exorbitant privilege that the U.S. could just print money to pay for things while everyone else had to actually earn it. So he ordered the French Navy to literally sail to the U.S., drop off paper dollars and bring back physical gold bullion.
Sending a warship to pick up your gold, that's a power move.
It was a direct challenge to American power, and it started a quiet run on the bank. Other countries saw what France was doing and thought, well, I better get my gold before it's all gone.
So U.S. gold reserves just start draining away.
Draining. And by 1971, the situation was critical. The whole system was bleeding out.
Which brings us to that weekend in August 71. Nixon is cornered. The markets can smell blood in the water. What were his options, really?
He had three, and they were all terrible. Option one, the austerity route.
Meaning?
Deflate the U.S. economy. You'd have to raise interest rates to the sky, slash government spending, stop the war, and the social programs. It would strengthen the dollar and stop the gold from leaving.
But that would cause a massive recession.
A depression, probably. And Nixon had an election coming up in 72. That's political suicide.
Okay, so that's out. Option two.
Devaluation. You just admit the dollar is weak. You say, okay, a dollar is now worth, say, 1/70th of an ounce of gold, not 1/35th. It fixes the math problem.
But it's humiliating.
Totally humiliating. It's admitting the U.S. isn't the king anymore.
Yeah.
And it really angers your allies who are holding all those dollars in good faith.
So that leaves option three, the nuclear option.
Break the system. Just close the gold window. Stop convertibility entirely.
And this is where the story gets really cloak and dagger. Because this wasn't debated in Congress or at the UN.
No, it happened at a secret meeting at Camp David. Total secrecy was the #1 priority. Nixon gathered his top economic guys, Paul Volcker, John Connally, and whisked them away.
They told the press it was just a routine meeting.
Right. But inside, they were fundamentally rewriting the rules of the entire global economy.
Why hide it like that? Why not have an open discussion?
Panic. Absolute panic. If word had leaked on Friday that the president was even thinking about closing the gold window, every central bank in the world would have dumped their dollars. The U.S. gold vaults would have been empty by sunrise.
They had to blindside the world.
They had to. That's why they chose Sunday night. All the markets, London, Tokyo, New York, they're all closed. You drop the bomb when no one can react. By the time they open Monday, it's a new world.
So Nixon goes on TV. He looks calm. He frames it as protecting the American worker from international speculators. He closes the window. Monday morning arrives. What happens?
Chaos. Pure chaos. Foreign governments are calling the U.S. Treasury saying, we'd like to exchange our dollars, please. And the Treasury just says, sorry, the window's closed. The anchor was gone.
And all those fixed exchange rates just dissolved.
They dissolved. Currencies began to float against each other, their value moving up and down based on market sentiment for the first time in decades.
And this is the birth of what we call fiat money. Let's pause on that term because we hear it a lot. What does it actually mean?
Fiat is Latin. It basically means let it be done or by decree.
Yeah.
So fiat money has value not because it's backed by a physical thing like gold, but just because the government says it has value.
It's money backed purely by authority.
For authority and confidence.
Right.
That's it. It's a psychological construct. A dollar is worth a dollar because we all agree it is.
But in the 1970s, that agreement got very, very shaky. The aftermath of this wasn't a smooth transition. It was a decade of pain.
It was incredibly volatile. Without the discipline of the gold standard, that physical limit on how much money you can print, inflation just took off.
People always blame the oil shocks.
And that was a huge part of it, yes. But the monetary fire was already lit in 1971. The value of the dollar just plummeted. Wages couldn't keep up with prices. It was a brutal decade.
Now, this is where the internal documents get really interesting. There's this huge gap between the public story and the private reality. Nixon said the suspension was temporary.
He did. And to be fair, for the first few hours, maybe some of them hoped it would be. But the internal memos show they knew very quickly that they could never go back.
Why not?
Because repegging to gold would have required that brutal austerity we talked about earlier. It would have meant the U.S. government had to stop spending more than it earned.
And politicians, as a rule, do not like to stop spending.
Not at all. And this is the most crucial insight from this whole deep dive. The switch to fiat money didn't just change the currency. It completely changed the incentive structure for governments.
How so? Unpack that for us.
Well, under a fiat system, they realized deficits don't matter in the same way.
How does moving off gold make debt easier to handle?
Because of inflation. Under a gold standard, you have to pay your debts in something real gold. You can't just print more gold.
Okay.
But under a fiat system, your debt is in your own currency, dollars. So if you have a massive pile of debt, inflation is actually your best friend.
Because it makes the money you owe worth less.
Exactly. If the government owes $1 trillion and they let inflation run hot for a few years, the real value of that debt shrinks. They get to pay it back with cheaper money. It's a kind of default without actually defaulting.
So the temporary measure became permanent because it gave the government this new superpower, the ability to run deficits forever.
That's it. And just look at the data since 1971, the U.S. national debt. It hasn't just gone up, it's gone up exponentially.
Yeah.
Credit expansion became the agent of the entire economy. We went from a system based on saving and producing to one based on borrowing and consuming.
And this brings us right to the consequences that you, the listener, are feeling today. The sources draw a straight line from that night in 1971 to the rising inequality we see all around us.
It's a phenomenon called asset price inflation. When a central bank creates a lot of new money, that money has to go somewhere.
And it doesn't go into the average worker's paycheck first?
No. It goes into the financial system, it flows into stocks, bonds, real estate.
So the price of all those assets gets inflated.
Correct. So if you're someone who already owns assets, if you have a stock portfolio, if you own a home, this system has been very, very good to you. Your net worth has soared. But what if you're someone who just works for a wage?
Your wages are sticky. They don't rise nearly as fast.
Exactly. So and then you see the cost of housing, education, healthcare, all these things tied to assets skyrocketing, while paychecks just struggle to keep up. That gap between people who own things and people who work for things, it just widens and widens.
It creates this treadmill that's always speeding up. You have to run faster just to stay in the same place.
And debt becomes the only way to bridge that gap. Before 1971, debt was something you avoided. After 1971, for governments and for households, debt just became a way of life.
And there's a global side to this, too, this democratic deficit. I mean, the decision was made by a few guys in a room.
Right.
But the consequences fall heavily on developing nations.
Hugely. Most of the world's debt is denominated in U.S. dollars. But the rest of the world has zero say in U.S. interest rate policy.
So if the Federal Reserve raises rates to fight inflation in America,
it can accidentally bankrupt a country in South America or Africa, because suddenly the interest payments on their dollar-denominated loans become impossible to afford.
It's like taxation without representation on a global scale.
In a way, yes. The U.S. dollar is the world's reserve currency, but it's managed for domestic American interests. That central tension has been there since 1971, and it's a huge reason you see countries today, like the BRICS nations, trying so hard to find an alternative.
It really puts all the current headlines in perspective. We worry about inflation, debt ceilings, housing bubbles.
But we rarely think about the fact that these aren't just random events. They are features, not bugs, of the system we switched to.
The Nixon shock wasn't just a historical moment. It was the big bang for the economic universe we now inhabit.
Absolutely. We traded the rigid stability of gold for the flexible growth of fiat. But that flexibility comes with a lot of fragility. And we are seeing those stress fractures everywhere now.
And the most incredible part of it all is just the lack of consent.
That's the philosophical heart of it, isn't it? Money is a social contract. It works because we all agree it works. At Bretton Woods in '44, there was a negotiation. Nations signed a treaty.
In 1971, the contract was just rewritten, unilaterally.
No vote. No referendum. The public never walked into a voting booth and checked a box saying, yes, I'd like to switch to a system where money can be created from thin air.
It just happened.
It just happened. And we've all been living inside that experiment ever since.
It really forces you to look at the money in your wallet or, the digits in your bank app totally differently. It's not some static, objective measure of value.
It's a measure of trust in a specific political institution.
Yeah.
And trust is a very finite resource.
That is a sobering thought. We've covered the history, the mechanics, the fallout. But before we let you go, here is the final thought to chew on.
Let's hear it.
We've established that the entire monetary system we live under, the one that dictates the value of your savings and your labor, was created without any public vote. It was an emergency measure that just became permanent.
Right.
So the question is, if the social contract of money can be rewritten overnight by a handful of people in a secret meeting, could it happen again? And if the next Nixon shock happened this Sunday night, would any of us be more prepared than they were in 1971?
That is the question that keeps a lot of people up at night.
Thanks for listening. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.